Welcome to the Highland Wonders Podcast, where we share stories and knowledge from experts about the charismatic species and diverse ecosystems of the Okanogan Highlands of north central Washington. My name is Jen Weddle, and I am a co-director of Okanogan Highlands Alliance, a nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to protecting the beautiful Okanogan Highlands, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Okanogan First Nations in British Columbia, and the Okanogan, Lakes, and Colville bands who are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Believe it or not, this episode is kicking off Season 4 of the Highland Wonders Podcast. We are so grateful to be in this beautiful place, where there is always more to learn, and to have so many expert educators willing to share their understandings of natural history with us. So without further ado, welcome to Season 4. It's gonna be great. No matter where you are in north central Washington, you are not very far from a grassland. If you are listening to this podcast from Okanogan County, chances are pretty good that you can see one right now. You might have to squint. Whether it's shrub steppe or a Highland meadow, you don't have to be a science nerd or a wizard of observation to recognize that there is a lot going on in that habitat. Taking a walk through a healthy section of grassland means winding your way through a complex, multi-layered community of shrubs, grasses, and flowers, and probably sensing some little bird, mammal, reptile, or insect eyes watching you from a safe distance as you noisily bumble along. From the outside looking in, it can be hard to know how to go about learning more about native grasslands. A lot of the plants kind of look alike. Well, lucky for us, Don Gayton, ecologist and grassland specialist, is here to give us a friendly introduction to this fascinating plant community, complete with an introduction to the tiny grass body parts that serve to distinguish one grass species from another. By the end of this episode, you will be ready to wow your family and friends with advanced vocabulary words like mesic and gloom and festucae, and ready to advance on to the next steps in learning about the beautiful habitats and species right outside our doors. This podcast was first presented at the Community Cultural Center of Tonasket in 2014. Enjoy!
We've got moons on our shoulders and stars in our eyes. We know just what we're doing and we know it's right.
I have to be careful when I say I'm the grass guy, but I am very interested in grasslands and have kind of knocked around in grasslands in a large part of Western North America. And I always consider them the sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of ecosystems, that they get no respect. And so it's my life mission to raise the status of grassland, native grasslands in particular, and try and get people a sense of their importance and their beauty. And the real challenge is identifying grasses. And most people, given the choice between root canal or identifying grasses, would opt for the root canal. And I can't say as I blame them, and I've struggled with it over the years. They all look the same. But there are some basic distinctions that I'm going to present to you, in very, very sketchy form as sort of an industrial botany class, but it's really a teaser in the fields where you can really learn them. And of course, I start with the Okanogan Highlands and then the Big Sky country. If you look not only from the aesthetic perspective and the botanical perspective, but what I would call like an architectural perspective. You've got layers and layers. You've got a moss and lichen layer. You've got low grasses. You've got tall grasses. You've got low shrubs, tall shrubs, and trees. There are 3 shrubs that are very important in our grasslands: antelope bitterbrush, big sagebrush, and rabbitbrush. And they kind of cohabit with a lot of our native grasslands. This shrub steppe biome is crucial, and much of it has been extirpated from the Columbia Basin. And, we have some of the larger extents of shrub steppe left in the Okanogan Valley. The shrub steppe does extend north of the border, basically in a really narrow ribbon going up the Okanogan Valley, and another side ribbon going up. It's the Similkameen that heads off to the northwest. And it is remarkable how, the border in so many respects is artificial, but there is a dramatic shift as you go across the border southward, and the valley suddenly opens up a lot wider, and the mountains aren't as steep and as tall. I owe a heavy debt to the people who have gone before me in terms of their knowledge of grasslands. And Richard Mack, who is a professor at Washington State University and a very innovative, thoughtful guy, he wrote a paper many years ago that really struck me, and he defined this evolutionary difference between the Great Plains and the Intermountain grasslands, or the Pacific Northwest grasslands. And he pointed out that, as the glaciers disappeared 12,000 years ago, bison moved into the Great Plains and subjected those grasses to very, very heavy grazing pressures that, in most cases, year-round, huge herds of bison would come in to the countryside and just completely graze everything, and then move on and come back again maybe 6 months later or maybe 5 years later. But over the long course of time, there was huge grazing pressure in the Great Plains of both Canada and the United States. Our intermountain grasslands had very, very minimal grazing pressure. There's really very, very little evidence of bison ever making it across the mountains into the valleys and the Columbia Basin. There's a few incidents, but mostly it was elk, deer, and sheep, and those were hunted by the First Nations people because they were an extremely important food. So our grasses evolved under very minimal grazing pressure. As a consequence, those three grasses that I referred to are very sensitive to grazing. And if the grazing pressure, particularly springtime grazing, it can knock them out right away, and the grassland then reverts to other species. And in many cases, it's introduced species. Unfortunately, this transformation occurred in many cases, in the 1880s or 1890s, before we really had a sense of how our ecosystems worked and before botanists got in and really had to take a look at it. And plus the fact, like I say, one grass looks like the other, and what's the difference? So we are coming to realize now how fragile and how valuable those three grasses are. They're particularly sensitive to spring grazing. So if you can arrange grazing rotations so that those grasses have a chance to get up and running and get their leaves out and so on, then they're going to have a better chance. But, like I say, you can drive through this country and I see miles and miles of areas that there's very few native grasses left. I monitor these grazing exposures, and, you need a decade. If it's real dry soil and if it's badly overgrazed, maybe 2 decades. But there's almost always, the remnant little native grasses and native plants that'll be there, and they will eventually come back. There's occasionally sometimes when like cheatgrass or other invasives will take over and then everything just stops. You can't get any succession going on. And you see that like with reed canary grass. In dryland situations, if there's enough time, they'll come back. But there are still plenty of areas that, you can find the full-on native suite of species. Roughly 30% of the biomass of a mature bunchgrass is above ground. The rest of it is these fine roots that can extend, depending on the soil type, a meter, maybe 1.5 meters, maybe even 2 meters into the soil. And roughly a third of those roots will die every winter and become organic matter, or humus, if you will. The lupins and the milk vetches, those are both in the legume family. They both fix atmospheric nitrogen, so they play an important role in the grasslands in that they bring in nitrogen from the air. So the bunchgrass biomes throughout the world have been the victims of their own success. The soils were so rich and productive because of this 10 millennia of organic matter being put into the profile all the way down into 1 meter down. Most of them were plowed up and put into annual grain production right away. The whole Palouse Prairie was originally all bunchgrass, some of the deepest soils in the world, and of course you combine that with 10 millennia of organic matter deposition in those soils, and voila, you have the best dryland wheat soils in the world. It's a significant shift when you lose bunch grasses and go to other shallow-rooted types. So the shrub steppe ecosystem, the bunch grasses really create the matrix for all those other herbs and shrubs and so on. And our eyes naturally will go right to that one little, tiger lily or that one little flowering plant. And they skip over all of the green stuff that provides the matrix in which these broadleaf plants will grow. I'm indebted to Dale Swedberg for an incredible database of the flora of the Sinleakin Wildlife Refuge. I went through it the other night and pulled out some of the key grasses. And so they've listed all the grasses, but they also listed them in terms of general abundance, and it was sort of a 1 to 4 scale, 1 being the most abundant and 4 being the least abundant. And, going back to what I said earlier about the conversion of our native grasslands to introduced species, that 5 of the 8 most common grasses in the Sinleakin are introduced species. The native ones are blue bunch, Idaho fescue, and sheep fescue. The reed canary grass, it's a bit like the Kentucky bluegrass, that it's both native and introduced. The European variety that came over, the genetics were so much more aggressive that it essentially overwhelmed the genetics of the native species. And so now all of our reed canary grass, which is the sort of riparian species, is a very aggressive introduced species. A native grassland of British Columbia or the Pacific Northwest has the highest terrestrial biodiversity, i.e. the highest number of species per acre per hectare of any of the other terrestrial ecosystems. The only ones that exceed it are wetlands, and riparian areas generally have greater biodiversity. So it's something that we kind of pass over and not realizing that this is just these kind of scruffy little landscapes. But actually, if you start adding up all the insects, the butterflies, the plants, the mosses, the lichens, the small mammals, and so on, the biodiversity per hectare per acre is right up at the top. And I think I can generalize, and for both Canada and the US, the grassland biomes in general have the least amount of protection in terms of parks, protected areas, ecological reserves, that sort of thing. And again, we converted these lands early on into agriculture, and that's where we put our Walmarts and our cities and our suburbs. I think in many cases just not realizing that these are ecosystems that have an intrinsic value and some right to existence. I just touch on this briefly, it's another hobby horse of mine, is fire ecology, which has a great deal to do with grasslands, and particularly the grassland-forest interface in these dry ecosystems. Our ecosystems are classified as fire-maintained ecosystem. Historically, they were fire-maintained, and this would be fires occurring on a 5 to 30-year basis, something like that, up until about the 1880s or 1890s. We, in our wisdom, shut those fires off, by and large, and as a result, we get this twin phenomena of forest ingrowth and forest encroachment, which gradually shifts the boundary of the forest downward in elevation and extends out into areas that were traditional grasslands. There's no question that wildfire suppression is important. It will always be with us, but some of us are trying to bring fire very carefully back into these landscapes. So now we're into the root canal part of the presentation. Because I've been on this mission to kind of get people to look at and think about native grasslands, I've tried to do what I call sort of industrial botany, and I'll walk you through this, but you have to go through some just horrible, gory little finicky botanical terms of the grass seeds and the grass inflorescence first. And I have also based it on a book called The Plants of the Pacific Northwest and the Southern Interior of British Columbia. And I want to make a disclaimer, I don't get royalties from the publisher, but it's kind of like the only book that's commercially available that has the decent pictures, that has a reasonable description, that doesn't include stuff that will never see. So in lieu of anything else, I've kind of used that as a point of departure for this industrial botany. So yeah, I can, the hair is starting to stand up on the back of your neck, whether you're remembering high school botany and those horrible terms. I want to bore with you with a couple of names, and these are the only ones that I'm going to ask you to remember tonight, and this is my holy trinity of the key grasses of the Pacific Northwest bunchgrass ecosystem. You have all seen blue bunch wheatgrass. You may have not recognized it as a plant, but you look up on the hillsides and you see this sort of inverted cone. It's like an inverted pyramid, fairly tall, grows on pretty dry slopes. That's blue bunch wheatgrass, and it's a key constituent of our native grasslands, all the way from eastern Oregon up into Midway, up into around Kamloops, and even farther north from there, mostly in the valley bottoms and along the sides. Blue bunch will take very, very dry conditions. Idaho fescue is slightly more mesic or more moist conditions. It looks superficially similar. It has that same kind of inverted pyramid shape to it. And then rough fescue occupies the best grassland habitats that are just short of becoming forest. So it occupies the deepest soils and the most mesic situation. And then once you're into forest, pine grass is typical as a forest understory grass. But these three, I think, are worth trying to commit to memory, learning what they look like and their growth habitats. Quite often you'll have the residual leaves from previous years accumulating at the base of all three of these grasses. Blue bunch, it has a really fine, thin, unbranched seed head. Idaho fescue, very, very similar shape. The flowering stems are very tall. The distinction between Idaho fescue and rough fescue is it's nice to know, but it's not essential. They occupy fairly similar habitats, have fairly similar ecological relationships. But if you're a nerd like myself, then you're going to make those distinctions. There are two kinds of monocots. Grasses are one, and then all the lilies and sedges and so on are the others. Grass stems are mostly hollow, but there's one or two exceptions, but generally you can kind of pick out, and rush stems tend to be thick and kind of spongy. This is where it gets down and dirty. Some people, have these really expensive 20-power high-end lenses and so on. 3-power is all you need, and you can get them for $4.95 at a science store or a kid's store, or even just a hand lens for reading is enough. But you do need, in many cases, a little bit of magnification to see some of these fine little structures. The floret is the technical term for a seed. But the trouble with the term seed is ambiguous, because if you think of like a wheat seed, it's just the naked embryo, but seeds generally have two coverings over them, a lemma and a palea. And in some cases they shatter off, but in most cases, particularly with our native grasses, they are firmly attached to the embryo. And so the floret is the collective term for the embryo plus the lemma and the palea, those two kind of papery coverings. The lemma is always the larger one, and the palea kind of fits inside of that. When you're looking at the inflorescence of a grass, it's best to do it in July and August and September when they're fully mature and the structures are fully developed. All of the taxonomic distinctions between grasses revolve around the inflorescence. So you kind of have to dig into that part. All right, so the floret is the basic unit. The next unit up in this sort of hierarchy is called the spikelet, and that's one or more florets plus two structures that are at the bottom called the glooms. And these are actually sterile florets, but they are at the bottom of every spikelet, and they're kind of papery-like. And when you take those plus the florets on top, that unit is called the spikelet. The awns, or that little whisker that you see attached to the end of a lot of grass seeds, is also a very important diagnostic feature. In many cases it's not there, and in some cases it's 2 inches long, depending on the species you're dealing with. And what usually comes off the very tip of the lemma, but occasionally it will come off the back rather than at the tip, and that's a taxonomic feature. Now, the challenge is that there can be more than one floret per spikelet. Some grasses only have one, some may have 7 or 8 stacked up. But there will always be those two structures at the very bottom, the two glooms, and then everything is kind of telescoped in, but it goes in sequence. It's a kind of a stair step. The first floret's on one side, the next one the other side, and it goes back and forth alternating. But that whole thing would be pulled right down, in many cases, right into the gloom. So when you're teasing apart the inflorescence of a grass to do the identification, use the very tips of your fingers, hold the base, the pedicel, and then start picking the florets out until you get down to those two sterile structures at the bottom, the glooms, because they'll be important in the ID process. All right, so the floret, then the spikelet, and then now the next term I'm going to introduce is the whole 9 yards, which is either a spike or a panicle. So a spike is an unbranched inflorescence, and a panicle is branched, and that's a key distinction. And it's fairly obvious, and if you think of, quackgrass is a good example. That's a spike. It's not branched. And sometimes you need to take the inflorescence and bend it to make sure that the florets or spikelets are attached directly to an unbranched main stem, because sometimes the branches can be very short. Grasses that have panicles will, as the floral stalk emerges, everything is pushed right tight together. But then as the plant matures, then you'll see how things branch out, the seeds start to fill out, and then you'll see the full-on panicle. So watch for that. And again, that's why it's best to do this kind of ID work July, August, September, October, because you can get fooled in April, May, and June. All right, so this is the last piece of the puzzle, in that there's a whole raft of grass tribes, but we're fortunate in that most of the grasses in the inland Pacific Northwest will fit into 4 main tribes. There's some exceptions, particularly the ones in riparian areas and alpine, but your typical lower mid-elevation grasses, most of them will be found in these 4 tribes. So this is kind of the basis of my grass ID for dummies. Each one is named for the kind of key species, and they are all laid out in that book, The Plants of the Pacific Northwest. So the first of the 4 tribes, the Hordeae, and it's the one that is an unbranched panicle. It's called a spike, and there's some pretty important grasses in, wheat is a member of this tribe. Barley are wheat grasses, both the native ones and the introduced ones. And probably everybody here knows quackgrass because you got it in your gardens, and it's a nightmare, but it's in that family. Agrostidae is the first of the families that has a panicle. And the key diagnostic here is that there's only 1 floret per each spikelet. And again, so you have to get out in there with the tips of your fingers, particularly when the things are nice and mature, and pluck the seed out and see if those little papery glooms are the only thing that's left. If there's more than 1 floret per spikelet, then you move to the next tribe. You probably know the needle and thread grasses. They're spear grasses, they're called. With some of them have really long awns, and when you're a kid, you'd throw them at your sister's sweater and they'd stick in it. And those are in the Agrostidae, and there's just 1 floret per spikelet. Some of them have little short awns, and some of them have quite long awns. And the interesting part of those needle grasses is they have the awn is actually coiled up like a spring. And it's a seeding mechanism. When it gets wet in the spring, that coiled up portion of the awn starts to uncoil, and it drills the seed into the ground. So it's a really cool mechanism. Pine grass is if you're in a kind of an open ponderosa pine or maybe Douglas fir forest, and you see this emerald carpet of green with very few seed heads, that's probably pine grass. It doesn't flower very often. It can make a whole carpet of grass as a forest understory. The Festucaceae is the biggest family, and it's a really challenging one because you've got some important grasses in there, the bluegrasses and the fescues and the bromes, and they're tricky to sort out because some of them, the inflorescence are quite small. But the key thing here is that there's more than 1 floret per spikelet, and the other key thing is that if you're measuring the length of the glooms versus the length of the first floret, the glooms are shorter than the first floret. A lot of the stuff that you're going to see in this area is going to be in this family, particularly as you go up into the highlands. A lot of the species will be in this tribe. The last one is the Aveniae, and there are actually not very many at all. Probably the key one is June grass, and June grass is best to identify just because you recognize it by eye, because it's one of those that just really pack together and it's really hard to tell what's going on. But June grass is pretty obvious to pick out when you're out in the landscape. With the Aveniae, and if you think of oats, with those big, long, papery things that enclose those are the glooms. And so that distinction there is that the glooms are longer than the first floret. So there you're done. Bob's your uncle. Those are the 4 tribes, and it's a piece of cake. And there's 2 ways of going at learning any kind of plants. There's one is reading the textbook, and the other one is going out in the field with somebody who knows them. And ideally, you can do a combination of both. And then there is another phenomenon that I call botanical rust. And you spend all summer relearning this stuff, getting it all fixed in your mind. And then next spring you walk out and it's just a blank, like you've forgotten everything. I thought it was just me that went through this, but it turns out that other people confess that they have the same problem. And it's not about age. It's just, you put it away in the fall, you don't think about it until next spring, and you have to kind of get the recall mechanisms going. And so that's why, summer and spring field trips are always good to just kind of get the juices flowing again. One other distinction is the creeping rooted versus the bunchgrass type, and that's a very important distinction. And the bunchgrass is the blue bunch wheatgrass or the rough fescue. The creeping rooted is, think of quackgrass or a lot of riparian species like Kentucky bluegrass. A lot of turf grasses are creeping rooted. The bunch grasses have those fine roots, those really fine, almost hair-like roots. The sod grasses or the rhizomatous species do have those fine roots, but they're quite shallow and they're always attached to a big, heavy rhizome. And like with quackgrass or couchgrass, it's sort of a white, creamy color, and it's quite thick, and it usually grows horizontally just below the surface. Sod grasses obviously are much more tolerant to grazing because their growing points are actually underground, whereas these guys, they're up above the soil surface. It's not a hard and fast distinction. Some bunch grasses, when they're in really mesic, wet conditions, will creep out a little bit, and vice versa, but generally you can sort of see the difference between the two. And then the last distinction is annual versus perennial. Most of our grasses are perennial, but there are some annuals. Almost all of the annuals that we see are introduced. There's only 1 or maybe 2 native annuals that we would find in this part of the world. Generally, you can tell because they flower really early, and cheatgrass is the benchmark annual invasive, and it'll flower in late April and May in many cases. And cheatgrass also has the ability to germinate either in the spring or in the fall, whereas most perennials can only germinate in the spring. And I'm finishing with a poem, a wonderful American writer by the name of Louise Erdrich. I would be converted to a religion of grass, sleep the winter away and rise headlong each spring, sink deep roots, conserve water, respect and nourish your neighbors, and never let trees gain the upper hand. I really like that line. Such are the tenets and dogmas. As for the practice, grow lush in order to be devoured or caressed, stiffen in sweet elegance, invent startling seeds, these also make sense. Bow beneath the arm of fire, connect underground, provide. Be lovely and do no harm.
As this episode draws to a close, we thank Don Gayton for making a challenging topic not only accessible, but fun. We are sure you are inspired to learn more, so check the episode notes for additional resources to learn about the unique history and ecology of native grasslands, and to get involved in a cool citizen science opportunity. This podcast is produced by Okanogan Highlands Alliance. OHA is based in Tonasket, a town in the heart of the Okanogan Valley of north central Washington. We are inspired by the beauty and diversity of the landscape that surrounds us, from the aspen and conifer forests to the Highland lakes to the tumbling creeks that descend to the wide, glacier-carved Okanogan River Valley. We engage in environmental advocacy, habitat restoration, and educational activities in our efforts to protect local ecosystems for future generations. To learn more about OHA or to become a member, please visit our website, okanoganhighlands.org. Our theme song, Blessed Unrest, is written and performed by Tyler Graves and Andy Kingham. You can support the artists by finding and downloading the full song from your favorite music platform.